They said Savannah was built on grace and charm. That its balconies hid romance and its streets whispered history. But some histories are buried for a reason. Some stories are locked away not because they are forgotten but because they are too dangerous to remember. In 1923, when the Vance mansion on Gaston Street was torn down brick by brick, a construction worker struck hollow wood behind a wall that should not have existed. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, blackened with age, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked away like a secret meant to outlive everyone who knew it. The book was heavy, not just in weight but in meaning. The names inside were familiar. Old Savannah names. Families still spoken of with respect. But the dates and numbers made no sense. They did not match shipping records. They did not match land deeds. They did not match anything that should have been written down. The handwriting was careful and graceful. Feminine. Every line precise. Every entry calm. As if what was being recorded was perfectly normal. When the ledger reached the Savannah Historical Society, the curator read only 3 pages before locking it away. He did not explain why. Only that it would require special permission to view. Permission that was almost never given. The ledger described an auction. But not the kind held near the river where cotton and timber were sold under the sun. This auction took place indoors. Behind closed doors. No public record. No witnesses who would ever speak. The currency was desire. The merchandise was human beauty. This is the story of that auction. A story rebuilt from the ledger. From letters found in estate sales. From a servant girl who learned to read in secret and wrote what she saw when she thought no one would believe her. And from the long silence that followed certain families for generations. This is what happened in Savannah in the spring of 1847. Margaret Vance stood alone at the window of her drawing room, watching rain slide slowly down the glass. The street beyond her garden wall was empty. The cobblestones shone dark and slick, reflecting the gray sky like a mirror. She was 34 years old, the mistress of one of the finest homes in the city. Wife to Richard Vance, a respected cotton factor whose name carried weight along Factor Walk. She had everything a woman was supposed to want. And she was suffocating. The house was quiet, too quiet. Her husband would not return until evening. Her children were upstairs with their governess. The servants moved softly, trained to be unseen. Margaret felt like the house itself was holding its breath. She touched the window glass. Her reflection stared back at her. Her beauty had not yet faded. Dark hair still thick, skin still smooth. Men still looked when she passed. But beauty locked away was a kind of cruelty. Richard touched her once a month. Always in the dark. Always without words. He was not cruel. He was simply absent. His passions lived in ledgers and shipping schedules. She was expected to be grateful. She was expected to have no hunger. The knock came at exactly 3 o'clock. Margaret turned, already pulling her face into a polite smile. "Come in." Her maid Betsy curtsied. "Mrs. Beaumont and Mrs. Caldwell are here to see you, ma'am." Margaret frowned slightly. They had not sent cards. That was unusual. "Show them in. And bring tea." Catherine Beaumont entered first. Tall, sharp, pale eyes that missed nothing. A woman whispered about but never challenged. Her husband controlled ships. She controlled rooms. Louisa Caldwell followed. Softer, kinder looking. Known for charity and gentle words. Married to a judge who spoke often and listened rarely. They sat. Tea was poured. The weather discussed. Names exchanged. But something sat heavy beneath the talk. Catherine's fingers tapped her cup. Louisa glanced toward the door again and again. Finally Catherine set down her teacup. "Margaret, what we say today cannot leave this room." Margaret nodded slowly. Louisa leaned forward. Her voice trembled. "Are you happy?" The question struck like a slap. Margaret answered before she could stop herself. "No." "In your marriage?" Catherine asked. Margaret swallowed. "Richard is a good man. But he does not see me. I feel like an object. Something owned." Louisa exhaled sharply. "Yes. That is it." Catherine smiled without warmth. "We are decorations. Proof of our husband's success. Not women. Not creatures of desire. What if we refused to accept that, Margaret?" Margaret's heart began to race. "What are you saying?" Catherine pulled a folded paper from her bag and laid it on the table. "There are 6 of us. All wives. All wealthy. All invisible." She unfolded the paper. Names filled the page. Catherine Beaumont, Louisa Caldwell, Eleanor Drayton, Judith Abernathy, Sarah Oglethorpe, Margaret Vance. Margaret stared at her own name. We have watched you, Catherine said. We know the look of hunger. The look of neglect. You wear it like we do. What do you want from me? Margaret asked. Louisa spoke softly. We want something that belongs to us. Something no one can take away. Something that cannot say no. An affair, Margaret whispered. No, Catherine said sharply. Affairs make women powerless. She leaned in close. We want control. An auction. Margaret felt cold spread through her chest. You mean slaves? Catherine's eyes did not blink. We mean men. And in that moment Margaret understood that what stood before her was not freedom but something far darker. Something born from silence and rot. Something that would stain every name written in that ledger. And the auction had already begun. Power does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers while someone else is half asleep. Sometimes it signs its name without looking at the page. Thomas Abernathy was already drifting when Judith spoke. The candle beside the bed burned low. The room smelled of ink and old paper. He had spent the day in meetings and arguments and figures that blurred together. His eyes were closed. His mind was elsewhere. Judith sat beside him, calm and careful. She had chosen this moment for a reason. I might need additional hands for the house, she said softly. The summer will be busy. Entertaining. Improvements. Talk to the overseer, Thomas murmured. Get whoever you need. Some of them are already spoken for, Judith said. I would need your authorization to redirect them. Fine, fine, write it up. I will sign in the morning. That was all it took. The next day Judith placed a document among several others on Thomas's desk. Bills, letters, orders. He signed without reading closely. He trusted his wife. He always had. The paper authorized the purchase of 6 male slaves for household use. Names were listed, ages, prices carefully negotiated to avoid attention. Nothing unusual, nothing that would raise concern. Within days the transfers began. Quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. The men were not brought to their homes. Not yet. Instead they were sent to a small farm outside Savannah. The land belonged to a distant cousin of Catherine Beaumont. A man who lived well and asked little as long as money arrived on time. He did not ask why 6 healthy men were delivered at night. He did not ask why they were kept separate. He did not ask why women sometimes arrived in closed carriages after dark. He locked the gates and took the coins. The ledger recorded everything. Names, dates, sums, notes written in that same calm feminine hand. No emotion, no explanation, only facts. Catherine oversaw the preparations with cold precision. Louisa handled the arrangements that required a softer touch. Judith secured the paperwork. Eleanor and Sarah ensured discretion within their own households. Margaret watched and waited and felt something inside her twist tighter each day. They told themselves stories to sleep at night. They told themselves they were only using what the law already allowed. That no one would be hurt more than they already were. That this was not cruelty but control. That this was justice of a kind. They told themselves lies. The men arrived one by one. Isaiah came first. 28, tall, strong, a carpenter by trade. He had been promised work in the city. He was shackled instead. Samuel followed. Barely 20, quiet eyes. A singer at night in the quarters. He stopped singing after the first night on the farm. Then Peter, Elijah, Moses, Henry, each man taken from a different place. Different owner. Different story. None told the truth. They were kept apart, fed enough to stay strong. Watched closely. Spoken to rarely. When questions were asked they were answered with silence or the crack of a whip against a post nearby. Never on flesh. Only enough to remind. The women came together at Catherine's house to discuss details. We must be careful, Louisa said. They are not animals. Catherine looked at her coolly. Do not pretend mercy now. We crossed that line the moment we began. Margaret said nothing. Her hands shook around her teacup. The auction was planned for a single night. No bidding paddles. No raised voices. Each woman would place her bid in advance. Names would be drawn. Assignments made. Order. Control. No chaos. Judith asked the question none of them wanted to say aloud. What if one refuses? Catherine did not hesitate. They cannot. The law does not allow it. And if one resists, then he will be punished. Not by us. By the system that already owns him. Silence followed. Margaret felt sick. The night before the auction she could not sleep. Every sound felt too loud. Every shadow seemed to watch her. She thought of Richard sleeping peacefully beside her. She thought of her children upstairs. She thought of the men on the farm staring at walls and wondering why God had gone quiet. She told herself she could still walk away. She did not. The farm was lit with lanterns when they arrived. The cousin waited at the gate. He tipped his hat and looked away. Inside the main barn chairs had been placed in a half circle. A table stood at the front. The men were brought in one at a time. No chains now, just watchful eyes and hands close to weapons. They were told to stand, to turn, to be silent. None of them spoke. Margaret could not meet their eyes. The bidding began. Amounts whispered, names written, pens scratching softly. The ledger absorbed it all. When it was done, each woman had claimed what she came for. No one smiled. No one spoke of pleasure. Only ownership. As they left the barn, Margaret glanced back once. Isaiah stood perfectly still, his face blank, but his eyes followed her. She felt something cold settle in her chest. This was not desire. This was not freedom. This was something that would not stay buried. And somewhere in Savannah a ledger waited patiently to be found. Evil rarely announces itself. Sometimes it wears silk. Sometimes it drinks wine. Sometimes it calls itself charity. The women arrived at the farm on a gray afternoon beneath low-hanging clouds. Their carriage wheels cut shallow ruts into the damp earth as they passed through the gate. To anyone watching, it looked respectable. 6 ladies of society visiting an outlying property to inspect conditions for the enslaved. A charitable duty. A moral obligation. That was the lie. In the barn, 6 men stood in a line. They had been washed, their hair trimmed, new clothes hung stiffly on their bodies. Someone had told them they were being evaluated for special household service. A promotion, perhaps, a better life. None of them truly believed it, but hope is hard to kill completely. Fear lived in their eyes anyway. Margaret stood with the others just inside the doorway. The smell of hay and damp wood turned her stomach. Her hands clasped together so tightly her fingers ached. They are handsome, she thought. That had been the point. Strong shoulders, straight backs, youthful faces. But now that they were standing there in silence, she saw more than bodies. She saw men, breathing, watching, trying to understand, and she knew what was being taken from them was not just freedom but dignity itself. They will do, Catherine said briskly. She walked down the line slowly, inspecting them the way a general might inspect troops. She lifted a chin here, adjusted a sleeve there. Her expression never changed. Judith, you have done well. These are exactly what we need. Eleanor Drayton shifted uneasily. What happens now? Catherine turned. Now we prepare them. They must understand their duties. And the consequences of disobedience. They need to be trained. Sarah Oglethorpe's voice barely carried. Trained. To serve us, Catherine said impatiently. To be pleasing, obedient, discreet. They are slaves. This is not unusual. But Margaret knew it was unusual. What these men were being prepared for was not ordinary service. They were being shaped into objects. Tools of pleasure. Forced participants in acts they could not refuse. It was rape. The word rang in her mind like a bell struck too hard. And yet she stood there. None of them left. Over the next 3 weeks the women returned again and again. Always in pairs. Always with careful excuses. Always under the polite fiction of benevolence. They spoke to the men. Watched them work. Measured their responses. Corrected their posture. Tested their obedience. Each man reacted differently. Samuel was resigned. He had lived his entire life in chains and knew resistance only brought pain. He survived by disappearing into himself. Elijah obeyed, but his anger burned close to the surface. Every movement was tight. Every glance defiant. Caleb was silent and strong. Daniel cautious. Joshua withdrawn. Thomas was different. He was quiet, controlled, observant. He answered questions politely, completed tasks without hesitation, revealed nothing. His eyes missed nothing. Margaret noticed him watching the women when he thought they were not looking. Measuring, learning, protecting something inside himself. She found herself drawn to him. Not with desire at first. With recognition. He carried himself the way she felt inside. Composed on the surface, locked tight beneath. She wondered who he had been before this. What life he had known. What dreams had been crushed. But she did not ask. To ask would be to admit he was fully human. And that would make everything impossible. The auction was scheduled for the first week of May. Eleanor Drayton's carriage house was chosen while her husband was away in Charleston. It was private, isolated, safe, or so they believed. The space was transformed. Heavy curtains covered the windows. Candlelight softened every edge. Chairs were arranged in a neat semicircle facing a small platform. A table held wine and delicate food as if this were a gathering of friends. Margaret arrived at dusk. She had told Richard she was attending a prayer meeting. He had barely looked up from his paper. The others were already there. Catherine stood tall and composed. Louisa sat rigid with her hands folded. Eleanor fluttered nervously. Judith watched the door. Sarah stared into nothing. Margaret felt like she was walking into a dream she could not wake from. At 8 o'clock Catherine called them to order. "Ladies, please take your seats." They obeyed. Margaret felt the absurd horror of it. 6 wealthy women in silk and jewels seated like judges while human lives waited behind a door. Catherine outlined the rules. Bidding would begin at $500. Increases no less than 50. Ownership determined by highest bid. Funds pooled to maintain discretion. No one objected. The men understand their position, Catherine continued. They understand obedience means comfort. Resistance means sale to Louisiana sugar plantations. Life expectancy measured in years. Margaret felt sick. The first man was brought in. Caleb stood on the platform. Strong, silent. The bidding began. The numbers rose. He was sold. Then Daniel. Then Joshua. Each time the same routine. Examination. Commentary. Bidding. Removal. Margaret did not lift her hand. Then Thomas stepped onto the platform. He stood tall, head high, eyes clear. His gaze swept the room and stopped on Margaret. For one breath they saw each other. She saw anger, intelligence, resignation, and something else. A quiet promise not to break. "Shall we begin at 500?" Catherine asked. 600 Louisa said quickly. 700 Judith followed. Margaret's hand rose before her mind caught up. 800. They turned to look at her. 900 Catherine said coolly. 1,000 Margaret said. Silence fell. The sum was outrageous. Catherine studied her, then smiled faintly. Sold. Thomas was led away. Margaret sat shaking. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. And somewhere deep inside she knew this choice would destroy them all. Some choices do not scream when they are made. They whisper, and then they echo forever. Margaret did not sleep the night after the auction. Thomas's face returned to her again and again. Not his body, his eyes, calm, knowing, as if he had already measured the depth of what awaited him and decided how much of himself he could afford to lose. At dawn she rose quietly and dressed while Richard still slept. He stirred only once, turning toward her without waking, his hand brushing her arm before falling away. She felt nothing, not guilt, not desire, only distance. By mid-morning a carriage arrived at the back of the house. Margaret had arranged it carefully. Thomas would be brought in through the service entrance. No neighbors would see, no questions would be asked. Paperwork had been prepared. He was now her property. The word made her flinch. Betsy opened the door and stepped aside. Thomas entered. He wore clean clothes. Plain, proper. His hands were empty, his posture straight. He did not look at Margaret at first. "You may go," Betsy said quietly. The door closed. Silence filled the room. Thomas lifted his eyes then. He did not bow. He did not speak. He waited. Margaret realized with a sharp twist that he had been trained to do exactly this. To stand. To wait. To obey without instruction. "You are to serve in this house," she said. "Yes, ma'am." His voice was steady. "You will be given a room. You will attend only to me. You will speak of nothing you see here." "Yes, ma'am." She could hear how carefully he said it. How little of himself was in it. You may go with the housekeeper. She will show you where to sleep. He turned to leave. Wait. He stopped. What is your name? He hesitated just long enough for her to notice. Thomas, ma'am, that is the name you choose to use. It is the name I was given. She nodded. Go. Over the following days Margaret watched him from a distance. He learned the house quickly. Moved quietly. Anticipated needs before they were spoken. He never lingered. Never met her eyes unless spoken to. Never forgot his place. It was infuriating. And frightening. She had bought him for control. For power. For desire. But the more obedient he became the more she felt herself shrinking. At night she dreamed of chains rattling in dark rooms. Of ledgers filling themselves with ink. Of hands she could not see reaching for her. Meanwhile the other women began to visit. Always one at a time. Always with care. Catherine arrived first. She surveyed the house with satisfaction. I see he has settled in well. Yes, Margaret said. Have you begun? Margaret stiffened. Begun what? Do not pretend innocence now. We did not go to such trouble for conversation. Margaret felt heat rise in her face. Not yet. Catherine smiled thinly. You will. Or you will regret hesitating. Control requires action. Louisa came days later. Her eyes were red. I cannot eat, she whispered. He stands there and looks at me as if I am already a monster. Are you? Louisa flinched. I do not know anymore. Sarah arrived drunk. She laughed too loudly, touched Margaret's arm too often. I thought it would fill the emptiness, she said. But it only made it louder. Eleanor did not come at all. Judith came last. This was never about pleasure, Judith said calmly. It was about power. Do not confuse the two. Margaret knew then that none of them were the same women who had first whispered in her drawing room. Something had shifted. Something had begun to rot. That evening Margaret summoned Thomas to the parlor. He entered and stood where she indicated. Close the door. He obeyed. She sat. He remained standing. You understand your position here? Yes, ma'am. And what is expected of you? To serve. Serve how? He swallowed. His jaw tightened. As you require. The words hung heavy between them. She could end it now. Send him away. Pretend this was all a terrible mistake. Instead she stood. Come closer. He did. She reached out and touched his sleeve. His body went rigid. Do you hate me? She asked. He was silent. Answer me. I cannot afford to hate you. The honesty struck her harder than anger would have. She stepped back. Leave me. He turned and went without a word. Margaret collapsed into a chair. This was not desire. It was terror wearing silk gloves. Across Savannah the other houses held their own silences. Caleb resisted. Sarah had him beaten. Not by her hand. By men who asked no questions. Daniel tried to run. He was caught before dawn. Shipped south within the week. Joshua complied too easily. Judith began to fear him. Samuel fell ill. No one called a doctor. Catherine alone seemed satisfied. Power suited her. The ledger recorded everything. Margaret began to understand the true horror. This was not about men at all. It was about what happens when people who have been denied agency take it back in the only way the world has taught them. By becoming the thing they hate. One night Margaret found Thomas standing at the window of the servants' hall staring out at the street. What do you see? She asked. A road. Where does it lead? Anywhere but here. She did not punish him for saying it. Instead she turned away. The house felt colder than ever. And somewhere in the city the other women were learning the same lesson. Some hungers do not disappear when fed. They grow teeth. Some secrets rot quietly. Others demand blood. By early summer Savannah felt heavier. The air pressed down on the city like a warning. Storm clouds gathered most afternoons but rarely broke, leaving everything damp and restless. Margaret felt it in her bones. Something had shifted and it could not be undone. Thomas had been in her house for 3 weeks. Nothing had happened. That was the lie she told herself. In truth everything had happened already. Every silence. Every look avoided. Every command spoken and obeyed. Power had settled between them like a third presence. Unseen. Unmoving. Watching. Margaret gave instructions carefully. Always practical. Always proper. She told herself this restraint made her different from the others. Better. But at night she listened for his footsteps in the servants' corridor. She learned the sound of his breathing when he passed her door. She hated herself for it. Thomas remained distant, polite, controlled. He revealed nothing. That frightened her more than defiance would have. One evening she found him in the study arranging Richard's papers. "You read well," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Better than most men in this city." He did not respond. "Who taught you?" "My mother." "Was she enslaved?" "Yes, ma'am." "Was." The word lingered. Margaret felt a chill. "Where is she now?" He paused. "Sold south when I was 16. "I am sorry." He looked at her then. His eyes were steady. "Sorry does not change what is done." She had no answer. Across the city the arrangement was unraveling. Louisa Caldwell stopped attending church. Whispers followed her through the market. Her servant Samuel had been seen limping badly. Someone claimed they heard shouting late at night. Louisa's charity visits ceased. Sarah Oglethorpe became reckless. She drank openly, laughed loudly. Her chosen man Caleb bore bruises he could not hide. Neighbors began to notice. Judith Abernathy tightened her control. Joshua was never seen outside. Her house grew quiet in a way that frightened even her servants. Eleanor Drayton wrote letters she never sent. Daniel's absence haunted her. She began to pray obsessively. Only Catherine thrived. She hosted dinners, attended balls, smiled easily. Her chosen man obeyed perfectly. Or so she claimed. Margaret sensed the truth beneath it. Catherine was no longer satisfied. The first crack came quietly. One morning Betsy approached Margaret pale and shaking. "Ma'am, there has been talk." "Talk of what?" "Of the farm, of the men taken there. Someone saw Daniel in chains headed south. They are asking questions." Margaret felt cold spread through her chest. "Who?" "Dock workers, servants, people who listen." That afternoon Catherine called a meeting. They gathered in her drawing room. Curtains drawn, voices low. "We have a problem," Catherine said calmly. Margaret already knew. "Loose tongues," Catherine continued. "Servants talk. They always do. We must remind them of the cost of speaking." Louisa's hands trembled. "You mean punish them?" "I mean protect ourselves." Sarah laughed sharply. "Too late for that." Silence fell. "We should end this," Eleanor whispered. "Before it becomes worse." "End it how?" Catherine asked. "Return the men. Pretend nothing happened." "You know that is impossible." Judith nodded. "We are already committed." Margaret spoke before she could stop herself. "We are destroying them." Catherine turned slowly. "Do not pretend innocence now, Margaret. You bid highest of all." The words cut deep. Margaret stood. "This has to stop." Catherine smiled coldly. "It will stop when I say it does." That night Margaret could not sleep. She rose and went to the servants' hall. Thomas stood there as if he had been waiting. "You should not be here," he said quietly. "I needed to speak." "About what?" "About freedom." A bitter smile touched his mouth. "You bought me." "I know." "Then freedom is a strange word to use." She swallowed. "I want to help you." "Help how?" She had no answer. He stepped closer. "You think kindness balances ownership. It does not. I never wanted this. But you chose it." "Yes." The admission broke something inside her. "What will happen?" Thomas asked. "I do not know." He studied her face, then nodded once. "Then you should be afraid." Days later the city buzzed with rumors. A shipment of slaves intercepted. Papers questioned. Names whispered. Someone had noticed patterns. The ledger filled with new entries. Not prices. Warnings. Catherine moved quickly. Too quickly. Caleb was sent away overnight. Samuel disappeared. Joshua fell ill and died within days. No doctor. No record. The arrangement was collapsing under its own cruelty. Margaret realized the truth too late. This was never something that could be controlled. It fed on silence, on fear, on the belief that power makes monsters safe. It does not. One night Thomas did not return to his quarters. Margaret searched the house, her heart pounding. She found a note hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the study. 2 words written carefully. "I remember." Outside thunder finally broke. Rain poured down like judgment. Margaret stood alone as the storm raged. She knew then that the ledger would not stay hidden forever. And when it was found it would not tell their story gently. It would tell it exactly as it was. Evil has a way of waiting. Patient, silent, watching until it knows you are weak enough to touch it. By midsummer, Savannah itself seemed to breathe differently. The streets smelled of heat and river mud, but also of whispers and suspicion. Margaret could feel it even within the walls of her own home. Something had shifted, and it was not only the men she had purchased. It was the women, the city, and herself. Thomas had remained quiet, but the calm around him was brittle. Every movement, every glance, felt measured, controlled, and full of unspoken understanding. He did not speak of the ledger, of the auction, of the horrors that had been planned and executed. He did not need to. Margaret knew he was counting, waiting, remembering. She had thought she was in control. That she had crossed the line of obedience into dominance, and that with money, planning, and secrecy she could shape everything to her will. She was wrong. It began with a simple question one morning. Margaret found Thomas in the pantry, organizing silverware. His hands moved efficiently, silently, as if he had been trained not only to serve but to vanish into the edges of the house. "Thomas," she said, "do you remember your mother?" He paused. His hand froze on the fork he held. She had not meant to ask, but the words slipped out anyway. "Yes, ma'am," he said softly. "Where is she now?" "Sold south," he replied. There was no anger in his voice, only a quiet, perfect resignation. Margaret felt bile rise in her throat. The thought of what had been done, what had been allowed to happen, suffocated her. Across the city the other women were unraveling too. Louisa Caldwell had taken to wandering her rooms at night, whispering to herself, drinking wine in small cups. Samuel, her chosen man, bore the marks of her frustration, though no one outside her house noticed. They were careful, always careful, but the fear and violence they had unleashed were beginning to creep back toward them like shadows in the corners. Sarah Oglethorpe had begun to sob at odd moments. Caleb had been shipped further south. She could not bear to look at anyone without remembering the brutality she had sanctioned. Eleanor Drayton wrote letters to friends she would never send. Daniel had been moved out of sight, and the quiet of the carriage house seemed to haunt her, whispering of consequences she did not dare name. Judith Abernathy was the only one who appeared unchanged. She had learned to cloak herself in calm. But even she was not immune to the dread that now dripped into every household the women owned. Catherine Beaumont remained the architect of cruelty. The ledger in her care recorded every transaction, every movement, every command, every consequence. She smiled in public, attended balls, presided over dinners, and maintained the illusion of charm. But in private she moved like a shadow through her own house, inspecting her property with cold efficiency. Margaret knew the next meeting was inevitable. The women gathered at Catherine's home in the late afternoon. The air was thick and heavy, promising rain, but none fell. Inside, the drawing room was still and silent. The curtains blocked the dying sunlight. The faint smell of wax and wine lingered. Catherine spoke first. "We have a problem." Margaret's stomach tightened. She already knew. The ledger, the men, the shadows that had begun to gather, they could not be contained. Louisa whispered, "I cannot do it anymore. I cannot live with what we have done." Sarah laughed suddenly, sharp and hollow. "It is too late to stop now. You cannot stop it. You cannot undo it." Eleanor, pale and shaking, finally said something aloud. "What will happen to us if someone finds out?" Catherine's smile was thin. "We survive as long as we continue. As long as we obey the rules we set. But the moment one of us falters, all of us are lost." Margaret felt her throat dry. She knew then that the horror they had unleashed was not confined to the farm, to the carriage house, to the men who were bought and sold. It was here, in this room, in their hands, in their very blood. That night Margaret returned home. The house seemed colder than it had before. Shadows stretched across the walls in strange angles. She thought she could hear whispers from empty corners. Thomas was in the kitchen preparing supper. He did not look at her when she entered. Margaret sat at the table. She could not speak first. He did. "You look tired," he said. She wanted to scream, to confess, to beg forgiveness. But she could not. She had crossed the line, and the line had already moved far beyond her reach. "I am," she whispered. He nodded once. "That is all you can be." She realized then that he had been right. Ownership did not bring satisfaction. Power did not bring freedom. Money did not bring control. It brought only waiting. And now the waiting had teeth. Over the next few days Margaret noticed subtle changes. The other women began visiting less openly, their steps quieter, their words more clipped. Whispers traveled the city streets, low and insistent. Servants began to move differently, glancing over shoulders, hesitating when told to perform a task. The fear and cruelty that had once been carefully hidden now leaked into every corner. Margaret began to write notes to herself, observations, thoughts she would never show anyone. But she could not stop the images. Caleb's eyes, dark and wary. Samuel's resignation. Joshua's silence. Thomas's composure. Each man a living reminder of her complicity. At night she dreamt of the farm. The ledger. The auction. The men standing on the platform, looking at her, looking at the women, measuring everything. She woke screaming, sweat on her skin, alone in the dark. And always, Thomas was there in her mind. Calm, watching, waiting, not a servant, not a prisoner, something else entirely. Margaret realized that the ledger would not remain hidden forever. It had already begun to haunt them. Every step, every choice, every movement of their lives was now part of a story they could not erase. The horror they had created was not only for the men they had purchased. It was for themselves. And somewhere, in the quiet of the city, the ledger waited patiently, recording every word, every command, every violation of morality and law. Waiting for the day it would be found. Waiting for the judgment it would bring. Margaret knew it. Catherine knew it. The others must have known it too. And yet no one could stop. Because once the line had been crossed, there was no returning. Only the slow, relentless pull of consequences that had been set in motion by their own hands. The women were trapped, and Thomas, calm and dignified, remained at the center of the storm, a witness to the horrors that had been built around him, yet untouched, untouchable, and waiting for the moment to remind them all that cruelty has a memory longer than any ledger. If you want, I can immediately create part 7 in the same gripping style, continuing the story with escalating tension and moral collapse. This part will keep the horror vivid and the pacing cinematic for YouTube storytelling. Do you want me to do that next? Some nights the house breathed. Margaret knew it before she opened the door. The floors whispered under her feet. Shadows stretched across the walls, unnaturally long and dark. Something moved where it should not have been. Thomas was not there. She had expected him to be, as if his presence alone could anchor her to sanity. But he was gone. The thought should have terrified her. It did not. It made her more aware of what they had done, of what they were still doing. Across Savannah, the whispers were louder. Servants spoke in corners, voices trembling. Neighbors murmured about unusual comings and goings. Letters from distant plantations hinted at intercepted shipments, missing men, or unexpected deaths. Each piece of news seeped into the consciousness of the women like poison. Margaret could no longer pretend this was harmless. It had never been harmless. Catherine Beaumont arrived first that morning. Her carriage rolled through the street like a dark omen. She entered Margaret's home with her usual composure. A smile that was too wide, too calculated, stretched across her face. "We have news," she said. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. She had known it would come. "The ledger has been noticed," Catherine continued. "Not the book itself, but the patterns. Shipments, transfers, names. People are talking. Questions are being asked." Louisa Caldwell had already begun to panic. She wrung her hands and whispered that she feared Samuel's disappearance might attract attention. Sarah Oglethorpe shook violently, her eyes darting toward every corner as if the walls themselves were listening. Eleanor Drayton sat frozen, her letters unsent yet screaming in her mind. Judith Abernathy's calm mask remained, but her fingers trembled around the teacup she clutched. Margaret knew what they all feared. Exposure. The consequences of being discovered were not merely social. They were legal, they were mortal, and worse, they were inevitable. Catherine leaned closer. "We must act. Control what we can. Silence those who are careless. We cannot undo what has been done. But we can manage what comes next." Margaret's hands shook. "You mean harm them?" Catherine's eyes were sharp. "We control them already. It is only a matter of maintaining order. One mistake, and all of us lose everything. Everything. That night Margaret could not sleep. The house seemed alive with warning. The shadows were longer. The floors whispered. Every footstep in the servants' corridor made her jump. Thomas appeared at her door just before midnight. He did not knock. He did not speak. He stood in the doorway, tall, calm, and impossibly steady. Margaret swallowed. "Why are you here?" He stepped forward. "You are awake." "Yes." He studied her. "You think you can control everything. I have to." "No, you think you have to. There is a difference." She did not answer. The rain began softly, tapping against the windows like a warning. He moved closer. "You are afraid," he said. "I am. Not for yourself. For them. For what we have done." His eyes did not waver. Every time she looked at him she saw the truth. The auction. The farm. Caleb. Samuel. Daniel. Joshua. Thomas. Not the men she had purchased. The men they had stolen. Margaret felt bile rise in her throat. She realized she had been trying to silence that knowledge from herself all along. Thomas stepped back. "Remember what I said. Power does not make monsters safe." She could only nod. Over the next week Savannah felt smaller. Tighter. The women could not leave their houses without feeling eyes upon them. Every carriage ride, every market visit, every whisper became a threat. Margaret tried to confine herself to her home, but even there she was not safe. Servants glanced at her differently. Betsy avoided her eyes. Every shadow seemed to grow heavier. The ledger was not silent. It was alive. Its entries multiplied. New names, new dates, transfers, notes. The invisible hand of accountability. Catherine called another meeting. The women gathered again in her drawing room. "We have to act," she said. "The men must be disciplined. We cannot afford mistakes." Margaret felt nausea rise. Discipline meant harm, punishment, threats. And yet, she could not speak against it. She had already crossed the line. Eleanor Drayton whispered, "We cannot go further." Catherine's eyes cut to her. "You have no choice. We cannot survive if one of us falters. Survival requires compliance." Sarah Oglethorpe shook. "Every day I feel sick. The things we have done. The men. The ledger. It is everywhere." Catherine's lips tightened. "Then it will be everywhere. That is the world. You wanted control. You have it. It has teeth. And now it bites." Margaret went home that night with her mind racing. She walked through the empty halls, past Thomas's quarters, past the servants' hall, past the silence that had grown oppressive. She tried to remind herself why she had participated. She had been lonely, invisible, denied desire. She had sought to claim power in the only way she thought she could. Now she saw the cost. It was not just the men. It was themselves. Every woman complicit was trapped. Every choice they had made had bound them tighter into a system they could not control. Thomas appeared in the kitchen again. He placed a candle on the table. He did not look at her. She sat. He waited. "You will not sleep tonight," he said. "I cannot." "Good. Then you will remember." She knew he was right. Memory was the only thing left intact. The ledger recorded facts, but memory recorded truth. Every look, every expression, every shiver of fear or defiance. Memory could not be erased. Margaret felt her chest tighten. She thought of the auction. The men, the bidding, the power they had claimed. She thought of the consequences spreading through the city. She thought of Catherine, of the other women, of herself. And she realized that nothing would ever be the same. The horror they had created was no longer a secret. It had grown into something alive. Something that did not need words. Something that would wait, patient and inevitable, to reveal them all. She shivered as rain began to fall harder. The house groaned under the storm. Every shadow seemed to move closer. Outside, Savannah slumbered, unaware of the danger that now stalked the very women who had thought themselves safe. Margaret understood. They had built their prison, and the doors were locked from the inside. And Thomas, calm, watching, waiting, the witness to everything, the memory that would not fade, the reckoning they could not prevent. The ledger would outlast them. The city would outlast them. The men would outlast them. And Margaret, for the first time, truly understood the meaning of fear. If you want, I can create part 8 next. where the story escalates further with rebellion, revenge, and suspense, keeping it cinematic and gripping for YouTube. Do you want me to continue to part 8? Fear does not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it creeps, sometimes it whispers, and sometimes it strikes in silence, when the moment is darkest. Margaret woke to the sound of movement outside her window. Rain had stopped. The streets were slick and empty, but something had shifted. The air was thicker, heavier, charged. She could feel it even before opening her eyes. Thomas was not in the kitchen. He was not in his quarters. He was gone. Panic rose in her chest, but she forced herself to breathe. He had always been careful, meticulous, calculating. If he had left, it was for a reason. And that reason was not to comfort her. By the time the first carriage arrived, Margaret understood. Something was happening beyond the city, beyond their carefully maintained control. The other women were already at Catherine Bowman's house. Their faces were drawn, their eyes restless. Louisa Caldwell paced. Eleanor Drayton wrung her hands. Sarah Oglethorpe kept her gaze fixed on the floor. Judith Abernathy alone remained composed. Catherine stood by the fireplace, her posture straight, her face pale but controlled. There had been news overnight. Serious news. Thomas had disappeared from the house. Not in secret, not quietly. Gone. The words hung in the room like a storm cloud. Margaret felt bile rise. Gone. Where could he go? Catherine's voice cut through the tension. He is not alone. He has allies. People we do not see. People we never suspected. Louisa gasped. Allies. Yes. Catherine's hands were tight around a folded piece of paper. Letters. Messages intercepted. Notes from plantation workers, from river dock hands, from people who saw what we did. He has not fled. He has begun to act. The room was silent. Each woman realized the magnitude of what had been set in motion. This was no longer about obedience. No longer about silence. No longer about control. This was rebellion. Margaret felt her stomach twist. She had thought herself in control. She had thought her actions, her decisions, her careful planning could contain this horror. She had been wrong. The ledger, Catherine whispered, will not save us now. Every name we recorded, every transaction we documented, every order we gave is now evidence. And he is gathering more. Margaret's mind raced. Thomas, the men, the farm, the auction, every secret she had tried to hide, every sin she had sanctioned, was now a weapon pointing at them. Catherine continued. We must respond. Calmly. Methodically. Every servant, every worker, every person in contact with them must be questioned. Every paper reviewed. Every ledger entry verified. We cannot afford a mistake. Margaret could not speak. Her throat was tight with fear. Louisa whispered. And if we fail? Catherine's eyes were sharp. Then we lose everything. That night, Margaret returned home, the house quiet except for the soft flicker of candlelight. Thomas was not there. Not a single sound, not a single shadow betrayed him. She moved through the halls as if she were a ghost, passing the rooms he might occupy. She felt his absence like a hand on her chest, pressing, suffocating. Suddenly, she heard a faint movement in the servants' corridor. Thomas. He stepped into the candlelight, calm, steady, watching her. No fear, no apology, only certainty. Margaret's voice trembled. Why are you here? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied her as if measuring every reaction. Then he spoke. You are afraid. I am, she admitted. Not for myself. For what we have done. For what they have done. He nodded once. That is right. Margaret swallowed. What will happen now? He smiled faintly. What must happen? You cannot control what you created. You cannot control what is already in motion. The weight of his words pressed on her chest. She had thought she held power. She had thought she commanded obedience. She realized now that she had only been playing at control, blind to the storm brewing around her. By morning, reports reached Catherine. Servants had been seen speaking to strangers near the river. Letters were missing. Goods had been moved without explanation. The farm outside the city had been visited by unknown hands. The women met again, trembling, pale, trying to maintain composure. But they knew. They all knew. The horror they had engineered was no longer theirs alone. Margaret could not look at Catherine without seeing a predator hiding behind a mask of civility. She could not look at Louisa without seeing despair. Sarah's laughter sounded hollow. Eleanor's hands shook constantly. Judith was the only one who appeared untouched, but Margaret knew even she was counting the cost inside her mind. Catherine spoke. "Tonight we take action. We must secure every entry, every exit, every servant. We cannot allow him to gather more. He is smart, but he is alone." Margaret realized that he was not alone. He had allies she could not see. People they had underestimated. People they had dismissed. And worse, he was patient. Thomas moved silently through the house that night. Margaret watched him, a mixture of fear and awe in her chest. Every movement was deliberate, calculated. Every step seemed to announce that he understood far more than any of them could imagine. He did not speak. He did not explain. He only watched, waiting, knowing that the balance of power had shifted. And Margaret knew the truth. They had unleashed something that could not be contained. The ledger, the farm, the auction, the men, the fear, the rules, the control, they were all crumbling. By dawn, the storm outside had begun. Rain poured down, hammering the windows, flooding the streets. The city seemed to shiver under it. Margaret looked out and saw the world reflected in the water. Dark, unpredictable, alive. Thomas stepped beside her, calm, silent, watching. Margaret swallowed. "What will you do?" He did not answer. Not yet. And in that moment, she realized that she and the other women had no future except to follow the consequences of what they had done. The horror they created would not stop until it had claimed them all. Some rebellions do not roar. Some whisper. Some wait. And Thomas, patient, steady, and unbroken, had only just begun. Margaret knew that by nightfall, nothing would be the same. Everything had changed. The ledger would bear witness. The city would remember. And the women who thought themselves untouchable would find that every choice they had made carried a cost far greater than they could imagine. If you want, I can continue immediately to part 9, where the story escalates to full reckoning, suspense, and confrontation, keeping the pacing perfect for a dramatic YouTube presentation. Do you want me to write part 9 next? Some truths refuse to remain hidden. By late summer, Savannah felt like a city caught in a storm that no one could escape. The air was thick and heavy. Every street corner, every shadowed alley, seemed to whisper secrets the women could no longer deny. Margaret had begun to understand the magnitude of what had been set in motion. What had started as curiosity, as loneliness, as desire, had grown into a living, breathing reckoning. Thomas had not returned to her house for days. His absence was deliberate, calculated. It left her unsettled, uneasy, aware that every footstep in the hall, every shadow at the window, could be his, could be anyone. He was moving through the city like a shadow herself eyes could not track, but always watching, always calculating, always in control. Margaret could feel it. Something was coming. Something inevitable. The women gathered again at Catherine Bowman's home, summoned urgently. The tension was immediate. Louisa Caldwell arrived first, pallid, clutching her shawl as if it could protect her. Eleanor Drayton's hands trembled as she set down her reticule. Sarah Oglethorpe's eyes were wide, darting, unseeing, while Judith Abernathy's calm composure barely masked her own fear. Catherine stood by the fireplace, her posture rigid, her eyes sharper than usual. There had been news. Serious news. Thomas had acted. Not openly, not violently. Quietly. With precision. He had liberated some of the men. Caleb and Samuel were gone, moved to unknown locations beyond the city. Daniel and Joshua were missing from Eleanor's carriage house. The farm outside Savannah had been emptied, leaving only ghosted tracks and whispering servants. The room went silent. Margaret felt her stomach turn. Gone. All of them. Catherine's voice was cold, measured, yet contained the tremor of fear she refused to show. He is not alone, she said. He has allies we could not imagine. People we dismissed. People who watched, who remembered, who waited. Louisa gasped. Allies. Yes. He has begun to take action. To correct what we have done. Margaret's mind raced. They had thought themselves untouchable. The women had believed that wealth, secrecy, and control were enough. They had been wrong. The consequences of their actions were now beyond their reach. Sarah Oglethorpe shook violently. "He is coming for the rest of them," she whispered. Catherine nodded. "And us." The realization cut through Margaret like a blade. The horror they had wrought was no longer contained. It had spread, moving through the city, gathering strength. Every decision, every bid, every moment of cruelty they had sanctioned had become fuel for this reckoning. Margaret went home that night with dread coiling in her chest. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. The servants moved cautiously, their eyes wary. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of silk, seemed magnified. She found herself in the study, staring at Richard's papers. Numbers, ledgers, letters. All meaningless now. They could not protect her. Nothing could. A faint sound drew her attention. Footsteps. Outside her door. Calm, deliberate, confident. Thomas. He stepped into the room. Calm, silent, watching. Margaret's voice trembled. "Why are you here?" He did not answer immediately. His eyes measured her, took her in, and weighed her. Then he spoke. "You thought you controlled everything." "I did," she whispered. "No," he said. "You obeyed rules you set yourself. You enforced fear. You counted money. You imagined power. But power does not make monsters safe. You are learning that now." She swallowed. "What will happen to us?" He stepped closer. "You cannot undo what is done. But you can witness the truth. You can remember. And you can live, if you choose to accept what comes." Margaret felt a shiver run through her. The house felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves were pressing in to hear his words. She understood for the first time the full weight of their crimes. Catherine, Louisa, Sarah, Eleanor, Judith, Margaret herself. Every woman who had crossed the line was now a participant in a horror that could not be hidden, controlled, or ignored. Outside, the streets of Savannah were waking to the storm. Whispers of missing men, strange arrivals, and empty farms traveled quickly. Servants were frightened. Merchants were uneasy. The city itself seemed to know that the balance had shifted. The women gathered once more at Catherine's house the next evening. Fear was written on every face. Margaret could see it in Louisa's shaking hands, Eleanor's pale lips, Sarah's darting eyes, Judith's tension held beneath perfect composure. Catherine herself looked steady, but Margaret knew the mask was thin. "We must act," Catherine said. "We cannot flee. We cannot hide. The storm is upon us." Margaret realized then that she had never understood the depth of the danger. They had thought they could manipulate human lives as easily as paper and ink. They had been wrong. The men they had bought, the auction, the farm, the ledger, all of it had escaped their control. Thomas had become more than a servant. More than a man. He had become a force. A reckoning. That night, Margaret could not sleep. She wandered through the halls of her house, past the servants' quarters, past the empty rooms, past the silent echoes of obedience and fear. She thought of the auction, of Thomas standing on the platform, of every look exchanged, every command obeyed, every scream and every silence. She realized she had been a witness and a participant in something monstrous. And now the monster was coming for them. Thomas appeared once more, as silent as a shadow. She could feel the inevitability in his presence. "Do you understand?" he asked quietly. She nodded, unable to speak. "Good," he said. "Then you will see. You will remember. You will learn that fear is not only in your mind. It is in your hands, in your heart, in every choice you have made." Margaret understood. The ledger would outlast them all. The city would remember. The women who thought themselves untouchable would find that every decision, every act of cruelty, every moment of imagined control carried a cost far greater than they could imagine. Outside, Savannah waited, unaware of the reckoning that had begun. Inside, Margaret realized she had no future except to face the consequences of what she had done. Thomas, calm, steady, unbroken, would be at the center of it all. The witness, the force, the memory that would not fade. And Margaret understood, finally, the truth of horror. It does not vanish. It does not sleep. It waits, patient, inevitable, and it comes for everyone. If you want, I can finish the series with part 10, delivering the final reckoning, shocking revelations, and closure for all characters, keeping it cinematic and gripping for a YouTube audience. Do you want me to write part 10 next? Horror does not end quietly. It arrives like thunder, sudden, violent, and impossible to ignore. Margaret woke to the sound of shouts in the streets below. Rain had stopped, leaving the cobblestones slick and dark. Smoke curled from chimneys, mingling with the early sunlight. Something had shifted. She could feel it in her chest, a weight pressing down like iron. Thomas was at the window, silent, calm, watching the chaos unfold. She had feared him. She had feared what he represented. But now she understood. He was not merely a man. He was the reckoning they had brought upon themselves. Outside, the city of Savannah roared to life with knowledge. The farm had been emptied. Caleb, Samuel, Daniel, and Joshua were gone. Their absence sent ripples through the city. Workers whispered, merchants questioned, families noticed. The truth could no longer be contained. Margaret felt bile rise. The ledger, the auction, every detail, every note, every transaction she had once believed was secret was now in motion. Catherine Bowman's home was the first to be visited. The other women had gathered, pale and trembling, waiting for instructions, for guidance, for some sign that control was possible. But Catherine knew. None of them could contain it. None of them could stop what had begun. The knocking on the door came first, soft but insistent. Then louder, more demanding. Servants trembled. Windows rattled. Margaret's heart raced as she realized the inevitable. They had been found out. Thomas stepped forward, calm, steady, watching. His presence alone made Margaret understand the truth of what was coming. The front door splintered under the first forceful blow. Margaret felt her knees weaken. Louisa gasped, Eleanor screamed, Sarah trembled, Judith tried to maintain composure, and Catherine's face paled. The men they had thought powerless had returned, not as servants, not as victims, but as the forces they had underestimated. The farm, the carriage house, the auctions, they had been merely preparation. They had learned, adapted, and now they acted. Caleb entered first, strong and silent. Samuel followed, his eyes sharp, unbroken. Daniel and Joshua moved like shadows, their presence commanding attention and fear. Thomas led them. He was calm, measured, and in control, the center of the storm the women had created. Margaret's hands shook. She wanted to speak. She wanted to apologize. She wanted to flee. But she could not. Fear rooted her to the spot. Catherine's voice quivered. What do you want? Thomas did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at each woman in turn. Every glance measured, every moment deliberate. You have lived in the illusion of power, he said quietly. You have thought that wealth, secrecy, and status could shield you from the consequences of your actions. You were wrong. Margaret felt her chest tighten. He was right. The men began to move through the house, taking nothing, breaking nothing, but their presence alone was enough. They were a reminder, a reckoning, a memory of all the cruelty that had been committed. Louisa fell to her knees. Please, she whispered. We did not understand. Samuel's gaze met hers. Understanding is not forgiveness. Eleanor sobbed quietly. We will never forget. Caleb's voice was low but firm. Nor should you. Margaret understood finally. There was no escape from the past. No way to undo what they had done. Every action, every choice, every moment of cruelty had been recorded, not only in the ledger, but in memory, in consequence, in the very air around them. Judith's hands shook as she tried to maintain composure. Catherine's pride faltered. Sarah's laughter had turned into quiet sobs. Thomas stepped forward. You will live, he said. But you will remember. Every moment, every fear, every choice. You have created your own prison. And now you must remain inside it. Margaret fell to her knees, understanding the truth of his words. She had sought control, power, and desire, and in doing so, she had bound herself to horror she could never escape. Outside, Savannah continued to wake. The city would remember. Families would whisper. The ledger would eventually be found. Secrets could no longer hide in shadows. The men turned and left, calm, collected, with no need for vengeance beyond what justice already demanded. The women were left in the wreckage of their illusions. Silence fell over Catherine's home, heavy, suffocating, and final. Margaret sat in the chair, trembling, knowing that her life would never be the same. The ledger would survive them all. It would speak of auctions, of cruelty, of desire misused and power abused. And the city would know, if not immediately, then in time. Fear had come, reckoning had arrived, and Margaret understood that the world had changed forever. Some hours later, when the city had quieted and the men were gone, she opened the ledger one last time. She read names, dates, sums of money, and every transaction of horror. She realized the truth: horror does not end quietly. It grows, it waits, and it always remembers. Margaret closed the book. She did not know if she would ever forgive herself. She did not know if Savannah would ever forget. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty: Thomas and the men had reclaimed what had been stolen. The women had been forced to confront themselves, their choices, and the consequences of believing that money and status could shield them from accountability. And in that realization, Margaret found a sliver of clarity. They had survived, but they had not been spared. The ledger remained, waiting, patient, and certain. It would speak to anyone willing to read it. It would record what had been done, what had been taken, and what had been reclaimed. Margaret knew it would be discovered one day. Perhaps in decades, perhaps in centuries. The story would travel, whispered through generations, a warning of what happens when human lives are treated as property, when desire and greed outweigh conscience, and when cruelty is given space to flourish. She set the book aside. Rain began to patter against the windows once more, soft and insistent, like the memory of everything that had come before. The horror was over, but its shadow would linger forever. Margaret rose, trembling, but alive. She had learned the lesson in the only way it could be learned: by living through it. And she would remember. If you enjoyed this chilling story, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more gripping historical and horror tales. Share this video with friends who love suspense, and leave your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. Every story deserves to be remembered, and your voice keeps it alive.